Got the veteran Labor Bruce Hawker and also the former Chief of Staff to John Howard, Grahame Morris, now with Barton Deakin. Grahame, let's look at Qantas first. Is there a division or a split in Cabinet on this issue? The Prime Minister seeming to send a very different message over the last few days, and this is the line of attack from the Labor opposition today, that Joe Hockey had created an expectation that there would be a debt guarantee for the airline, and now the government's walked away from that.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure that's quite right, but certainly the government said they would have a look at the debt guarantee, and they don't seem to be terribly keen on it. But look, I reckon the big news today on Qantas, and I think this is really, really important, is that the government has put into the Senate a change to the carbon tax bill. Now, you know, people say carbon tax. This is important because John Borghetti, the boss of Virgin, on the weekend was saying, look, the most important thing the government could do for all of us, and he's the captain of Virgin Airlines, he's saying get rid of the carbon tax. And today, not only did we have the captain of Virgin saying this, but we had the general, Richard Branson, saying he agrees with his Australian boss. Now, you know, it is an interesting exercise for the Labor Party. If they want to say they want to do something for Qantas, then why not get rid of this silly carbon tax? It's just you know, the government has quite been reasonable in this. Said we'll just have the change at the moment for the aviation industry. Well, why not?
Well, you're saying that of Virgin. I'll tell you what Qantas has said. Qantas' current issues are not related to carbon pricing. We've been clear that levelling the playing field is the most important policy measure that needs to be fixed, and with some urgency.
Well, levelling the playing field is another one. You know, is changing the Qantas Sale Act.
Is this a distraction from the government when Qantas is the issue that everyone's dealing with, and they've said carbon pricing is not the main issue? That's the statement from the airline.
But Kieran, you know, it's painfully obvious. If you're paying $100 million, it's not going to help your blinking airline if you're paying that in a carbon tax. And that's what they're doing. And even Virgin is saying, come out, they're no friend of Qantas, and they've said sort of, we agree with that. Look, there are two things. One is to change the Sale Act. The Labor Party doesn't like that either. And two is change the carbon tax. And is it the complete solution for our airline? No, it's not, but it's a bloody good start.
Labor says, Bruce, that this is a split between the PM and the Treasurer on what to do with Qantas. But isn't it probably more likely a strategy from the government to beat Labor this week over the carbon tax issue and the Qantas Sale Act, but then most likely provide a debt guarantee at the end anyway?
Well, it's sending out mixed messages, that's for sure, Kieran, and I think it is a split between Hockey and Abbott. I don't think they're that subtle in the way in which they go about things. I think Hockey spoke out of turn probably, went beyond his power in saying that they would be giving a guarantee, even though they'd be dragged kicking and screaming to that end. As to the carbon tax, I think that's just a giant red herring being dragged across the political stage by the government. You know, there's going to be a new Senate at the end of June, and at the end of June they'll do away with the carbon tax, and that won't be an excuse for the government anymore. I think this is much more a case of the government just looking for distractions away from the fact that as a result of the changes that they're going to, or not going to give the Qantas, they're not going to allow Qantas a guarantee that 5,000 jobs are going to go. And that means that maintenance is going to go offshore, and your catering and all those jobs which would otherwise be undertaken by Australians are now going to go offshore. If that's what the government wants to do, then that's what we're going to see.
But is there a chance that do you think that Labor should rethink its position on this, Bruce, given the challenges facing the aviation sector worldwide, but particularly Qantas, given it is hamstrung by the Qantas Sale Act?
You say it's hamstrung. On the other hand, it's a guarantee that Qantas is not going to just be swallowed up by, you know, a foreign owner who are no longer going to have Australian interests at the front and centre of the airline operations of Qantas. It'll be whatever suits that foreign carrier. So I think these are very tough decisions, but people should be in no doubt that if we do go down the path of allowing 100% foreign ownership or whatever, that's going to mean that Qantas in a very short period of time will probably no longer be an Australian company. The maintenance workers will no longer be employed in Australia, they'll be doing it overseas, and you're going to have a very different beast, and you're going to have 5,000 Australians out of work on top of the 20,000 who have already lost their jobs in the, or will have already lost their jobs in the car industry in the next 2 or 3 years. It's not a very pretty picture if you're an industrial worker in this country at the moment.
I spoke to Alan Joyce, the Qantas CEO, on Friday. He is still hopeful of securing this debt guarantee or a short-term response to what they say is something that needs to be responded urgently from the government. This was Alan Joyce on Sky News on Friday.
I know that they have the interests of the national carrier. I think everybody has the interests of the national carrier at heart, and I'm sure that they will come up with a short-term solution that balances and corrects that distortion. And we'll continue in dialogue with the government. I don't think it's appropriate for me to communicate or talk about what that dialogue consists of, but we'll continue with that dialogue going forward.
The Qantas chief on Friday. Now, Grahame Morris, when it comes to that idea that, well, despite the difference in message from the Treasurer and the Prime Minister, I know you haven't conceded there's a split or anything like that, but is this potentially part of a strategy, a two-punch strategy, where they use this week to put pressure on Labor over the carbon tax and on foreign ownership of Qantas, and then end up delivering it anyway, drag kicking and screaming, as Joe Hockey put it, to provide the debt guarantee?
I don't think politicians are that clever. No. No. The idea that there's some Machiavellian plan behind this to make Bill Shorten look like a bigger goose, I don't think that's right. What they've said is look, let's do something about the carbon tax. Yes, it's short term, but it helps. And the other is, let's have a look at this foreign ownership thing, whether or not there ought to be more injection into Qantas. And that is quite a big change. It's not all that long ago this wouldn't have ever been contemplated. But there are lots of ways you can do things. You can write the rules. It was being done with BHP and all sorts of things that you can write the rules so that there is foreign ownership, but without without the flying kangaroo ending up.
But Joyce has made it clear that that's not the short-term priority. The short-term priority is a debt facility backed by a government guarantee, not the foreign ownership issue.
Yeah, well, I think that makes a lot of people uneasy. Yeah, yes, Qantas is too big to fail, but by jingoes, there's a hell of a lot of companies in this country who would love to be guaranteed by the government. I'd like to be. I could get a very flash loan if that were the case. Or it's just a little bit off where the government is thinking at the moment, and for that to happen, I think everyone in the cabinet would have to think, hey, Qantas is about to hit a mountain, we have to do it. And I'm just not quite sure that they've reached that stage when there are other things that can be done.
Well, that was the point the Prime Minister said today, Bruce Hawker. Where do you see this ending up then? The Cabinet's going to be deliberating where to for Qantas in terms of its response tonight here in Canberra. Where do you see all of this ending up in a policy sense?
I suspect that they're not going to give any concessions to Qantas at all, and I think that's going to be a shame, because the history of airlines in this country has been that at very critical times in our history, because they do provide such a vital service to regional Australia and to overseas services and interstate, they need support of some description. We used to have the two airline policy, and then a lot of the reason why we had Qantas nationalised was because the earlier iterations of it were failing all around the country. It just might be that it's in the nature of the beast to require government assistance if it's going to continue as a national carrier. So my guess, though, is that notwithstanding all that, I think we're going to see the government refusing to give any support to Qantas, and the opposition will refuse to go along the path of foreign ownership, because that will basically be consigning it to foreign ownership and to offshoring a lot of jobs that decent Australians currently hold down around the country.
Let's take a quick break on PM Agenda. We'll be back in a moment with Bruce Hawker and Grahame Morris. This is PM Agenda. Thank you for your company with me, Grahame Morris and Bruce Hawker. Let's turn to the Prime Minister's trip to Asia. It was announced today, some of the details of it, including the largest ever business delegation to China, Bruce Hawker. The Prime Minister was playing down the concerns, recent tensions with Beijing, saying that you can make robust representations on geopolitical issues on the one hand, but still have a prosperous economic and growing trade relationship on the other. This has been the reality of Australia's ties with China for the last couple of decades, hasn't it?
Well, certainly there's been a growing interrelationship between the two economies, and that's been reflected in the exports of iron ore and coal and so forth. But the suggestion that you can go around saying whatever you like about China's foreign policy, particularly over this issue of the two islands in the East China Sea, Senkaku and Diaoyu, I think that's a real issue of concern for Australia generally, because what the government basically did there was stumble into a very, very big issue for China, and as a result, the Foreign Minister was very firmly reprimanded by the Foreign Minister. We know that an Assistant Secretary of DFAT has said it was the rudest treatment that he'd seen any minister receive in 30 years in the Foreign Service. So, this is an issue of huge significance to China, and I think we're going to find that we're going to have to be a lot more sophisticated in the way in which we deal with these issues if we're going to have a smooth relationship with China. And of course, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating as to whether we can get this free trade agreement up and running by October, which is, I think, when the Prime Minister said he'd have it done by.
Well, Andrew Robb is still hopeful of achieving that. I spoke to him a bit earlier after question time. I'll have that interview for you in the next half hour. But Grahame Morris, did the government go too far in that criticism? There's one thing, in terms of making your position known, but the way they went about it in terms of the East China Sea and the air defence zone that China established, did they go too far? No,
I don't think so, Kieran. There are many countries around the world who are a bit uneasy about almost the Chinese expansionism. And look, we're entitled to have a view. But I thought what was really interesting about today's announcement is that hundreds and hundreds of Australian business people said, hey, PM, can we come with you on the China tour and the Asian tour? It's not all that long ago that doing business with China was really hard work. Some of the early people, like soft drink makers, chocolate manufacturers, some builders, found it really heavy going. Some of the ethical practices, business practice in China, you wouldn't want to follow here. It is improving. And yes, it's a relationship that has to be worked on over and over again, but as I understand it, the Chinese are really very keen to have Tony Abbott coming. And remember, we're relying on each other a fair bit at the moment, them for the resources that we've got, and us, in their case, because they're a damn good trading partner. I think Tony Abbott will go all right. His foreign trips so far have been very good, and I suspect this will be another one.
Bruce Hawker, the Prime Minister said that the government is, in terms of foreign policy, can walk and chew gum at the same time. Is that the view, that pragmatic sort of approach that the Chinese would also take from your experience, that they would say, OK, we'll put those tensions, those criticisms to one side and then focus on that, ever-growing economic relationship? As Grahame said, there have been several hundred already put their hands up in terms of Australian businesses wanting to be a part of that delegation next month.
Well, yeah, obviously they're going to want to be part of that relationship with China because it's such an important one for Australian businesses. Whether or not China is prepared to go to the next step and have a free trade agreement with Australia is the big question. And we should never, ever underestimate the significance that China puts on its own region and its position in the region. This is the real issue that the Australian government has yet to really grasp about China. You know, they are no longer just the second fiddle player in Asia. They are number one there, and they want the world to understand that, and they do not want countries in their face over those sorts of issues. And unfortunately, whether that's right or wrong, they're big enough and ugly enough to be able to actually put some meat into all that. That meant they can actually put some grunt into it. So I think it's a big problem for Abbott to have allowed this deterioration in the relationship to occur, and it stands in stark contrast to the excellent first impressions that Australia was able to show to China when Gough Whitlam visited, first as opposition leader and where he met Zhou Enlai, and then as Prime Minister where he met with Mao, and you know, this really became a very important part of the relationship between Australia and China that exists to this day. First impressions do count, and Abbott's going to have to be very careful about the way in which he manages his foreign affairs pronouncements with the Chinese, because they'll be listening and listening carefully to everything he says. He can't get away with some of his glib, offhand sort of comments that he thinks he can get away with here. They'll be very careful. He'd need to be very careful.
I'm sure many of our viewers would have been thinking, Bruce, what about the first impression of Mr. Rudd when he lectured the Chinese at Peking University?
And of course, he then went on to have an extremely strong relationship with the Chinese. He was in a special, I guess, relationship with them because they were so impressed with the fact that they had a Mandarin speaker who could actually talk to them in their own language and speak to them at a very sophisticated level. You wouldn't have seen Kevin Rudd sort of falling into these issues over two disputed islands in the East China Sea.
Well, not everyone agrees with you on that assessment. I know one long-term observer said that Kevin Rudd could speak Mandarin but didn't understand Chinese. But we'll move on from that. I want to ask you about the Ukraine and this protest from the Abbott government in cancelling that visit by the Trade Minister. Does it really matter what Australia does, given on this very tense and dangerous situation on the other side of the world?
Well, I think it puts everything into perspective, this. Here we are in Australia today worrying whether or not somebody wins an Academy Award or whether or not somebody should own a bit more of Qantas or not. How would you be in the Ukraine when the entire blicking Russian army is in your backyard? This is really, really serious, and I think that we are entitled to say to the Russians, take a very, very deep breath before you take that extra step into the lounge room, sit down and have a yarn. That's what I'd be doing, and I think that's what most people are saying.
And this is something that has bipartisan support, Bruce Hawker. Tanya Plibersek, when I spoke to her earlier, supported that move by the government. It's not a great, impact on Russia, but I suppose it does show very strongly the force of the government's view on this.
Yeah, I think it's good to have bipartisan support in situations like this where there's clearly been a territorial incursion. On the other hand, though, Russia is not part of our region. China is, and that's why we're discussing China at length. Russia isn't. However, I think everyone would share the concerns of Tanya Plibersek, Julie Bishop, Prime Minister, and the opposition leader in ensuring that this escalation goes no further, because it could get very ugly in that region.
OK, Bruce Hawker and Grahame Morris, thank you both. Today, as always, good to see you both.
Pleasure, Kieran.
And after the break, I'll be joined by